Greetings, folks. How's everybody this evening? Excellent, excellent. What I'd like to do first is take a test of audience demography, if I may. And my question for you is this. How many people in here have an instrument rating or better? Anybody in here? Instrument rating or better? Okay, very good. And how many people in here have just soloed? Is anybody just soloed? Anybody here? Okay. Now, does the instructor know of that solo? I'm curious about that. Some people, of course, go the extra mile to motivate their instructor. They solo themselves, which is a rather unusual thing. I'm curious, folks, how many people have ever heard or seen me speak before? How many people have ever, well, there goes that material. Okay. Who has never heard or seen me speak before? Okay, excellent. And just out of curiosity, who doesn't want to hear me speak right now? Excellent. Folks, I'd like to ask you this question to start off with this evening. How many of you folks in here are familiar with the fine art of magic performed correctly? Good. That's going to make this trick go over real well. Stand by real quick here. Have I got a magic trick for you? Now, folks, I want you to watch very carefully. And when I say those magic words I learned in church, bingo, all of a sudden, whoa. Now, some of you are looking and going, that guy is good. Just look at that. That is just incredible. Look at that. 100 years ago, you'd have made me chief of the tribe for doing this trick. And now I can't even get one simple round of applause. Not even a little, oh, that's okay. Ah, darn. Actually, you know what? I did this for a group of Iraqi diplomats about 3 years ago, and I lowered the napkin, and they still couldn't get it. So, have to go back there someday and try it again. There's a very important moral to this story, folks, and that is this, that when you know what the magician knows, it's not magic anymore. And that was said by Donald Shimoda in Richard Bach's book, Illusions. And similarly, when we know how people think who have what I call the safety reflex, who have that attitude that allows them to have that extra survival potential in an aircraft, then it's not magic anymore. And tonight, what I'm going to talk about is that particular safety reflex and talk to you about how to get it based on the studies that I have done over the years with what we call cockpit psychology. And I find this most intriguing. I must tell you, already, based on talking to George and having an opportunity to share conversation with some of you in the back, I already know I'm preaching to the choir in this group. Nevertheless, this is something that we can talk about and I think still share and learn a great deal about, and that's the intent of the program tonight. And if you are as excited about aviation as I am, we will have a great time tonight because I do not believe in having any type of presentation where you don't have fun. I've been to so many presentations before where you're sitting in the audience and you look around and you look at everybody and nobody's having any fun. It kind of looks like what the family living room looks like after Thanksgiving dinner. Everybody's laying around, sort of spread eagle on the couch. It's as if Mom stuffed the turkey with Thorazine, if you understand what I'm saying. So allow me to have fun with you tonight. I'm the kind of guy that still gets excited by a 172 flyby. So aviation, some of you are going, I don't believe it. Honest to goodness, a 172 flyby. Strangely enough, I do. Folks, what is this unique quality that some people have talked about that has been coined the right stuff, the survival reflex, as I call it? What is this unique quality that allows people, certain people, to have a highly developed survival edge in the aircraft? To me, it's most fascinating to consider and to think about. And based on my research, I think I've come up with the idea. Folks, what I've noticed over the years is that people that fly aircraft that have this survival quality, this thing that the Chuck Yeagers and the Scott Crossfields of the world have had, seems to be an inordinate predisposition as a pilot when they fly to think defensively. In other words, they're always thinking defensively in an aircraft all the time. In terms of thinking defensively, it's not just going up in an aircraft and thinking in terms of, well, if a problem happens, I will handle it when it occurs. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the kind of defensive thinking where people think about handling the problem even before they get in the aircraft. And this is the thing that I think made up the mentality of Chuck Yeager and the people like Scott Crossfield, Neil Armstrongs, and many people of that particular ilk. A very important thing to consider. And again, we've called it the right stuff, but I call it the survival reflex for a very, very important reason. Folks, what we know from people that fly aircraft that do this and have this survival quality is that they have an inordinate predisposition to sense their own vulnerability. They know when they are very vulnerable. These are the kind of people that go the extra mile to protect this vulnerability. And Chuck Yeager, by the way, said in his book, The Autobiography of Chuck Yeager, an excellent book to read. And by the way, let me ask you a question. How many people in here have ever read Chuck Yeager's autobiography? Anybody ever read that? Okay. Wow, that's interesting. How many people have never read Chuck Yeager's autobiography? No, don't be ashamed. Raise your hand. Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed. Stick your hand up high. Don't be ashamed. Let me take a count. Get it up high. Good. Well, you should be ashamed of yourself, each and every one of you. How many people never raise their hand again? Okay. The thing I find most interesting is Chuck Yeager said this in his autobiography, a very good book to read. He said, "I was always afraid of dying in an airplane. I was always afraid of dying in an airplane." And it's my belief that that particular attitude, that mentality, is what allowed him to have such a very refined survival edge, a honed survival edge that kept him safe in a series of trials and tests that tested his survivability on every flight. Absolutely amazing. Now, the survival reflex I'm talking about is the kind of reflex where it's possessed by the guy who walks out to the airplane during pre-flight and he looks at the airplane. He looks at it from a distance even before he gets in the aircraft. I mean, he just looks at it to see if one wing has more dihedral than the other wing. Perhaps a student pilot flew it on the previous flight and added that extra dihedral to that left wing. That's possible. But he looks at the aircraft and he checks for oil leaks, and of course he expects not to see oil leaks unless, of course, it's an Apache, in which case that's common to see those things in an Apache. But he looks around the aircraft, and then he gets close to the aircraft and he takes out his fuel sampler and he checks the fuel, but because of this survival edge, he checks the fuel. He takes his sunglasses off before he actually looks at the fuel in the sampler. Now, there's a reason for that, because some people, when you dip the fuel sampler in there, you look out and you get strangely colored fuel, like orange fuel. And the reason you get that is because you have orange sunglasses on. But people are predisposed to think this way. They look at the problems and protect themselves that way. They look at the wheels of the aircraft and they check the nose strut to see if it's overextended or underextended based on its normal extension. And from that, as well as sensing how compressed the tires are, people are actually able to sense the center of gravity location on the aircraft just visually, like they used to do on the DC-3s. They used to check and see whether the tires were compressed or not compressed enough, or the military C-45. These people, when they get in the aircraft and they taxi, they can actually sense how well the aircraft handles during taxi to see if indeed they perhaps have a center of gravity problem, even, of course, after they've done a CG analysis on the aircraft. When they're going down the runway, they'll actually put their hand into their actual earphone right here and cup the headphone back so they can actually listen to what the engines sound like during the acceleration down the runway. And they're listening for engine problems. These are the kind of people that look at the fuel gauge and the oil pressure gauge, and if they see the oil pressure going down, they'll shorten the flight. And if they see the Hobbs meter actually stop working, they'll lengthen the flight, if you understand what I'm saying. These are the kind of people that have what I call the survival reflex. And that is something that some people are actually writing that down. Okay. Rod Machado says if Hobbs meter actually stops, it's okay to lengthen the flight. Okay, that's sort of an unwritten rule, but these are the kind of people that have that survival reflex. Let's talk about the rules for getting that survival reflex. It's a way of thinking in the aircraft, and folks, that's what I want to do tonight. I want to alter your perspective, and I know I can do it because I'm going to give you 6 rules, and at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you or let you listen to a tape that was an actual in-flight emergency recording tape of 2 gentlemen in an MU-2, with a wing full of ice, applying the rules that kept them safe, that allowed them to apply this defense reflex, this survival reflex. This will knock your wheel pants off. It's an absolutely amazing thing to listen to. But first, try this. Most of us in an aircraft do not use what we call modern-day psychology to fly an aircraft. And I'm as guilty of this as perhaps some of you are. In an aircraft, you and I have both been inclined to use what is known as 2,000-year-old psychology. Now, let me explain to you what I mean by 2,000-year-old psychology. In an aircraft, we know the common sense things to do in this case, but sometimes we actually find ourselves hoping when we are in the throes of an emergency, like icing conditions, we end up hoping. We end up doing what the voodoo witch doctor priests of many years ago used to do on the island of Bali. They would hope somebody would get sick. They would hope somebody would get in trouble. Folks, in essence, when we hope in an aircraft, we are doing nothing more than praying. Now think about this. You'll never find an owner's manual on this planet by any manufacturer ever made that says if pilot is in icing condition, he should hope to get out. You'll never find that. You won't, but we do that sometimes. Let me ask you this question. I want you to respond to me as truthfully as you can. Have you ever been flying along and all of a sudden had that engine start to sputter up in front? And all of a sudden it starts to sputter again and sputter a little bit more, and you start thinking, that doesn't sound right. So you check, and you've been doing a real good job of navigation. You're a little confused because you've been navigating to the Poughkeepsie VOR on the amp meter. But not a bad deal using that because it's pretty easy to keep that thing centered. And all of a sudden, the engine starts to get a little rough again, and all of a sudden, your electrical equipment fails, which is not too bad because the thunderstorms outside light up the cabin as you're flying along. And all of a sudden, you got a lot of smoke and everything else like that, which is pretty unusual because, you paid $39 for this transponder and nav package, and you got it out behind the shopping center at night with the serial numbers crossed out on the side. Well, that's no reason not to expect it to quit working right about now. And all of a sudden, you realize that your passengers in the back of the aircraft are a little confused about what's going on. They don't feel too comfortable with you flying this aircraft. One of them has reached into his flight case, pulled out a little Jesus statue, put it on the top of the dash for you, pulled out 12 candles, starts lighting those things, and one guy in the back's twirling his Pope soap and robe. And you look, and all of a sudden, your engine quits, just quits, graveyard dead. And folks, all of a sudden, have you ever found yourself saying this? Oh, man, I hope it starts again. Oh, if I could only get down. How many people have ever said that before? Now, be truthful to me. How many people have ever said, oh, if I could only get down? I'll raise my hand to that because I have, and I suspect you have. Folks, that is called praying. And if you're going to pray, my advice to you is this. If you're going to pray in an aircraft, and that's all you're going to do, and not that there's anything wrong with that, do me a favor. Pray into the microphone. I mean, just hold it in the direction your mouth is pointed, in between your mouth and the direction the prayer is going. And when you key the microphone and you go, I hope I get down, click and let go of the button, I guarantee your prayers will be answered. Because somebody's going to come up and say, Roger, 32 Bravo, come on down. And I would suggest what you do is pray on Spiritual Hotline 121.5. Guaranteed to get a response there. And folks, many of us are flying along, and we're out there talking, we're going, hello Allah, come in Buddha, speak to me, Krishna. And folks, what we do is this. Sometimes that's our strategy for dealing with problems in an aircraft, we hope. And I will tell you that the use of language, this power that we apply in the symbols we use, such as the words, if I say the word, it will help me get down. That is tantamount to 2,000-year-old psychology, not a very wise way to fly an aircraft. Again, remember, words, the use of words are very important because they allow us to be different from other animals. In fact, I always tell people, as a linguistic instructor told me in psychology school, that words allow us to remain dominant over the other animal species on the planet. Of course, my grandfather always said that the thing that distinguishes us from other animals is the fact that we are not afraid of vacuum cleaners. I don't know how true that is, but you can't tell me people don't hope in an aircraft. Consider this. Fuel, starvation, fuel exhaustion, in particular, fuel exhaustion statistics indicate, and this will knock your wheel pants off, 50% of the people that lost their engine because of fuel exhaustion, in other words, they ran out of gas, did so 50% within 1 mile of the destination airport, based on an aviation safety study of NTSB statistics. 50% within 1 mile. 76% of the people that lost their engine because of fuel exhaustion did so within 10 miles of the destination airport. And when the engine quit because of fuel exhaustion, 88%, according to these statistics, 88% of the people were still trying to make the destination airport. Now, what do you suppose they were doing as they were flying? Hoping, exactly. And what they would do is they'd see that little fuel gauge going to E, and then they'd say to themselves, gee, I wonder if that means enough. And then they would actually get a little closer to the side to let parallax make the gauge actually read more. Unbelievable, the things we do. And this is the 2,000-year-old psychology I'm talking about. But, folks, The real power in being able to fly an airplane safely is to use this defensive quality that allows us, again, thinking defensively in an aircraft. It's extremely important. When we fly an aircraft, many of us use this concept of fight or flight. We get in an airplane, we say, I don't care if there is thunderstorms out there, we're going to go flying anyway. We have a Cessna 150 here. It's a turbo model. This thing's got a lot of power. Been up to 5,000 feet with it one time, so they get in this thing, and it all does about a good 75 knots downwind with the tailwind. And they'll get up there, and they'll think to themselves, I will handle any problem if it occurs. Well, folks, that's fight or flight. That's not using defense mentality, if you will. The defense mentality, and this is very important that you get this, is such that people with this defensive capability, this defense mentality, think not of handling the problem when it occurs. They think about handling the problem before it actually occurs, and that's extremely important to consider. That's how they think, and that's how I want you to think. I have a lady friend who thinks very defensively. She has, in essence, made her life very comfortable for her because she thinks defensively. She's taken martial arts training. She's taken all different types of training. Her house has 6 deadbolts on it. 6, no, I'm not kidding, 6 deadbolts. And by the way, to show you how smart she is, she only locks 3 at any one time. That's right. This is very smart because she figures if a burglar is breaking in and they're unlocking 3, they're probably locking the other 3. She's a very smart lady. Take some time on this one. Very, very defensive. She thinks defensively, and that's how. And students, well, we have psychological defense mechanisms too. I just want to show you how important defensive thinking is in an airplane, and I'm going to prove to you we do not do defensive thinking in an aircraft. Students on a cross-country flight use psychological defense mechanisms when they get lost, because as a student, when you get lost, you're really not lost. You just sort of change where it is you wanted to go. That's what we do. Flight instructors think very defensively. I remember sitting, and I'm an active flight instructor, fly about 15 hours a week with different students. It's so much fun, and it really keeps your survival edge honed, if you understand what I'm saying. Not out of necessity, but more out of need in this case. We're sitting there, and I'm always thinking defensively. I'm always thinking, how can I handle the problem before it occurs in the aircraft? That's, again, what gave Chuck Yeager his survival edge in the aircraft based on what I've analyzed of what the man has done. This is most fascinating. In the aircraft, brand new student, actually not brand new, he's got about 2 hours of flight time, and I said, okay, now, Bobby, no matter what happens in the aircraft, you repeat exactly what I say to you. Because most students, of course, when they talk to the controller, they get a little nervous. Most students, most airline transport pilots, and most airline pilots do that too. And he says, okay. So I say, okay, push that little button and say, okay, just ready to push it, okay, and I say, now, tell the tower we want to take off. Say, this is 32 Bravo, ready for taking off. He pushes the button, and the guy goes, this is 32 Bravo, ready to take off. Click, and I said, fantastic. Tower comes on and says, well, there's going to be about a 4-minute delay, 32 Bravo. Today at Long Beach Airport, we're kind of busy. And I look away, and I say this. I go, oh, for Pete's sakes, what's the reason for the delay? And I look over. He had pushed down the button as I said that. Then he looks at me and goes, and I go, did you push that? And he goes, like that? And all of a sudden the tower comes on and says, what? You know, folks, when you say these kind of things at the airport, no matter how defensive you may be sometimes it can get the best of you. At the airport, if you say something like that, well, I mean, we had a great flight after we got out of the penalty box. But these are the kind of things that get tower controllers to say, Roger, 747, taxi to runway 27 position and hold, and you, 32 Bravo, taxi into position on runway 9. And gentlemen, you're clear for takeoff. Y'all be careful now. Have a real good flight, okay? The thing is, you have to think defensively in an aircraft. Defensive thinking is different from fight or flight, and I will show you some things that will knock your socks off as to what people have done to think defensively. Folks, if you were to be a martial artist, you would learn to do 3 things. You would learn to protect, in martial arts, vital areas. Number 2, you would learn to protect and conserve your energy. And number 3, you would learn to nullify the attack. That's what a martial artist does. Protect the vital areas, nullify the attack, and conserve the energy. In essence, martial arts becomes the art and the science of defending yourself. And if you can defend yourself in the spirit of Sun Tzu, who wrote a book many years ago that I think is an excellent book for pilots to read. It's called The Art of War. And Sun Tzu said, invincibility lies in the defense. Invincibility lies in the defense. And thereby we can protect ourselves if we think defensively. And folks, martial arts is real good to have, especially if you go to some of the busy airports around here. Because one time I was at Kennedy and I had to talk to a Hare Krishna because I didn't have enough money to buy a magazine. And Hare Krishnas, you know what I'm talking about. These are the people that wear orange robes, cut their head except for a little strand of hair going out the top, and take a vow of celibacy as if they had a choice. Defense. Consider this. In aviation, 80% of everything you learned as a private pilot was designed to protect you. And we get away from that. Consider this. 80% of every single thing you learned as a private pilot was designed to keep you safe in the air. Good example of that. Your flight instructor would take you up in an airplane, and as you were flying, he'd reach over and he'd pull that throttle back. He was giving you an opportunity to protect yourself by simulating an engine failure, and then you'd have to find a place to land. And some of you were really smart students. He'd pull that throttle back, and you'd say, what'd you do that for? And he says, well, your engine just quit. And you went, look, it's running again. Don't you touch that anymore either. That's defense practice. I was flying with an instrument student one time. I couldn't make this up if I wanted to. He's got the hood on, doing a great scan and everything, like we're going to talk about tomorrow night. He's doing a good scan, and all of a sudden I pulled the throttle back. I said, okay, Vic, your engine just quit. Okay, what are you going to do? And he goes, he lifts his hood up, and he looks outside. He says, oh, I'm going to land right there. I said, Vic, this is supposed to simulate being in the clouds. What'd you do? I said, oh, I just simulated clearing up. Bring back down there. Believe this guy. Folks, consider in an airplane. A defensive pilot thinks like this, and I want to give you a new way of looking at this. Your defense, somewhat similar to the martial artist's defense, is to protect three things. One, you always conserve airspeed all the time. You preserve airspeed. You want to have enough of that molecular stuff blowing over the wings so the big L stays on top and the big H stays underneath, right? You also preserve altitude because it's the reason why in an airplane when you climb out of an airport, you do not climb out at cruise climb out of most airports. You climb out at what? Stan, what do you climb out at? Yeah, excellent, Stan, excellent. That's exactly correct. How about a big hand for Stan for getting that question right up here? You climb out at best angle of climb speed. The reason for that is to get enough altitude so as to have an option for returning your airplane back to the airport or finding another place to land. Altitude is one of the most important, one of the three things that you need to do when you fly an aircraft. Protect the airspeed, protect the altitude. You also protect, in this case, the aircraft structure. And that's why when you fly an airplane, if there's any problem with the aircraft, as I'll talk about in a bit, you assay the problem. You test it using a four-step internal dialogue that I will give you. It's an excellent way to find out what's going on in your aircraft. But you protect the air in turbulence. In turbulence, you reach over and you have an automatic reflex. In any kind of turbulence, boom, the aircraft is hit in turbulence. Boom, threw up right and threw up left and turned up to the left and to the right and to the left. And you reach over, grab that throttle. That's the first thing you do and bring that power back to a speed that will allow you to fly the aircraft at or below what? Maneuvering speed, exactly. And then the second thing you do in this turbulence is you look back and you instruct all the passengers to take the barf bag and actually strap it onto their thing. Because the turbulence normally doesn't stop when you first get into it, and that's what you do. You protect yourself. It's defense. Folks, there's not a one of you in here that has not acquired this defense reflex. In an airplane, when it stalls, what's the first thing you do? Nose down, exactly. First, you hear that stall horn, you go, ooh, and you shove that nose down. If somebody in the back of the aircraft makes a sound like the stall horn, you shove the nose down. And that's a very important reflex. What I'm saying is this. After the private pilot license, 80% of the things that we learn are defense-oriented. After the private license, we stop thinking defensively. We stop thinking about protecting ourselves, defending ourselves in the airplane, and 80% of the things that we learned as private pilots were the things that keep us safe. And that's the whole point I'm trying to make. I remember being out at the airport one time, had a young lady, I was a 19-year-old flight instructor. Young lady came out, she was 26 years old, and we were going to go up and practice stalls. And I knew that when you practice stalls, sometimes the maneuver can be relatively, aggressive, so to speak, if you lower the nose, and sometimes students have a tendency to lower the nose a tad too much. So what happened was she brought her little baby out with her. Now the baby's only about a year old, and of course I'm a 19-year-old flight instructor, learning how to assert myself in command of my ship, my Cessna 150. And the lady came out, and I said, Barbara, you can't take that baby with us. And she said, well, why not? I said, because babies should not fly in aircraft. And she said, well, that's not a good reason. You better give me a good reason. Why can't I take this baby with me? And I said, Barbara, I am the professional flight instructor on this aircraft. I am almost have enough time to be chief pilot at the FBO. I am in charge of this aircraft. 91.3 says I am in command, and what I say goes, and I say that baby's not going, and that's it. Poof, no more. I will not take no for an answer in this case. No baby. That's fine. So, we're climbing out, and I'm holding this baby. Rule number 1. Never argue with a lady who's got a baby. But we take this little thing out and we're flying around, and I never realized it, but if you have a dirty airplane, and you take this baby and you put it on the carpet, it will graze for a while. It's the most amazing. Your airplane gets clean, but we were out there doing stalls, and I didn't think about it. She forgot about the baby, and I'm flying, and we're doing these stalls, and all of a sudden, you remember the Cessna 150s with the rear view mirrors? Remember those? Now I realize what they're for. To check for floating objects in the back of the aircraft. So we go into this one stall, she shoves down a little briskly, I look in the rearview mirror, and here comes this baby face coming up in the mirror. Most amazing thing I've ever seen in my entire life. But it was great, though. I don't know, I had this baby, and she made me feed this baby. You have to feed the baby, of course, otherwise it sounds like a stall horn as you're flying most of the time. I've got this little thing, and I'm feeding it like that. And I'll tell you, I learned something very interesting. You can feed a baby twice as fast when you do a 60-degree bank in the airplane. Most amazing thing I've ever seen in my entire life. But this is what we call the survival reflex, folks, and this is extremely important. Number 1, and this is an extremely important thing, in an aircraft what we must do, and this is the first rule of attaining this survival orientation, and the very first rule is this. In an aircraft, we always must first acknowledge our own vulnerability. Folks, this applies to an automobile, a car, a train, a skateboard, a bicycle, any, for that matter, a pair of shoes, any moving vehicle whatsoever. Before we get in that vehicle, what seems to typify those people with this survival orientation is they acknowledge the fact that they are vulnerable. Now, that seems trite and seems contrary, but I must tell you that Sigmund Freud said, man is the only creature that acts as if he or she will live forever. In other words, we are possessed to think that our existence on this planet will never end. In other words, that's the mentality we hold. A very dangerous mentality, I might add. It is not akin to allowing a person to survive. Chuck Yeager again said it, and I think it's so important. He said, I was always afraid of dying in an aircraft. Folks, we know that people, when they fly and they use a little common sense and they think defensively, it is so hard to get hurt in an airplane, you almost have to try. You almost have to. Airplanes are so incredibly safe. Do you know that there's never been in 14 years a recorded in-flight breakup, structural failure on a 172? I mean, these airplanes are very safe, along with other airplanes, but 172 in particular. Not one. 172 is really hard to break in flight. You have to want to. You have to say, today I'm going to go out and break my 172. And folks, I must tell you, even if you wanted to, you would probably have a hard time doing that. What I'm showing you, and I hope what you get from this part of the presentation, is that airplanes are very, very safe. And the problem is, when the pilot gets in the aircraft, if they don't think defensively, it's not the aircraft, it's the person in the aircraft, and the loss of that judgment, the loss of the defensive quality that allows people to be safe. Now, what I must tell you is this. When I go outside, and I'm going to give you my opinion here, when I go outside, if I'm going to get in a car, if I'm going to get on a skateboard, if I'm going to get in an airplane, it doesn't matter what it is. If I'm going to go for a walk, this is how I think. I say to myself, number one, I acknowledge my own vulnerability. I acknowledge the fact that death is with me. Now, I don't tell this to the other people in the aircraft. This is my own metaphor. It's my way of thinking of acknowledging my own vulnerability. It's the thing that keeps me safe. Can you imagine somebody else in the aircraft, and you look over at them and say, by the way, Bob, I want you to know something. Death is with us today. Now, how do you think that's going to make him feel? Now, I guarantee, all of a sudden you say that, boom, door will pop open, and there he goes. Hey, Bob, come back here. I was just kidding. Come on back. He's going to get something for the flight, like a dark robe and a hood. No, but that's the way that, in this instance, then, that allows some people to acknowledge, well, again, to get this defense characteristic I'm talking about. If you acknowledge that, you will do something to protect yourself. But most of the time, we don't do that. Again, please get this. We think that if a problem happens, we will handle it when it occurs. And folks, I must tell you, many of us are very clever. But sometimes in the throes of an emergency, no matter how clever we are, sometimes the right answers don't come. That's why we have to think about it before it actually occurs. The second thing we need to do, and this is very important, to me this becomes perhaps one of the most important qualities of being able to be what I call a person who has that common sense orientation, is to never underestimate the enemy. Never underestimate the enemy. Let me take you back to the year 1876, and let me put you in a place called Billings, Montana, and let me put you in Billings, Montana, actually 100 miles north of Billings, on June 25th, 1876. Your name is General George Armstrong Custer. You have 263 men under your command. Your job is to go out and fight the Sioux. For whatever reason, you're going to go out and fight the Sioux. Now, you, as General George Armstrong Custer, are supposed to wait for General Reno to attack the Sioux. But you decide you're not going to. You, as General George Armstrong Custer, are a compulsive, recalcitrant individual. Your job is to be as wild and crazy as you can based on the personality characteristic of General Custer. By the way, a man that achieved his battlefield commission by pulling out his saber when everybody else was yelling, retreat, retreat. He would pull out his saber and go, charge, right into the fray. His men would go, what is he doing? And he would ride into the fray. In fact, Custer was so wild. There's a story about him actually being out on the prairie. He's riding along with his men. He sees a buffalo riding across the prairie. He pulls out his gun and says, men, I'll be right back. And he races off. He's racing off after the buffalo. And as he's doing that, all of a sudden, he takes his gun out, goes to shoot the buffalo, boom, and shoots his horse in the back of the head. He had to walk 2 miles back to get to his man. What happened, General? Horse got shot. How'd that happen? Well, he stuck his head up. Shouldn't have. I just shoot right over there at the buffalo. Folks, this guy said, we're not going to wait for General Reno. We're going to go get those people ourselves. And General Custer told his Indian guides, he had 5 Indian guides at the time, men, let's go get those Sioux. The Indian guides got off their horse, reached into their satchel, pulled out a bunch of this war paint, put this war paint on, and the Indians had a chant they did before they went into battle, and they started going, hey, my, hey, 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 hey. And they got on their horse, and they rode to their death. 263 men. Amazing. And folks, I'll tell you what, if you ever get on an airplane and that cockpit door pops open and you hear coming from that cockpit, hey, my, hey, 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 my, hey. Get off that aircraft quick, get off, don't stay around, split, boogie, get out of there. What happened to Eastern Flight 401? Eastern Flight 401 in the Everglades. Those folks were subject to what? Underestimating the enemy, weren't they? They were flying their aircraft, and all of a sudden there was a little gear light on their aircraft, this L-1011. The gear light was causing them to be distracted, and they ended up knocking the autopilot off its altitude hold position at 2,000 feet, and they took their aircraft right into the drink. Folks, what happened to Air Florida in, I believe it was 1980-81, at Washington National Airport, where they took off with so much ice in their wings that they should have put chains on the wings in order to be able to handle all that ice. Not casting doubt upon the professionalism of those pilots, but they were caught. They underestimated the enemy. They were inattentive. Perhaps they were distracted. Do you realize that every single year, 15 people die from lawnmower accidents? 15 people. Now, I can see hurting a toe or hurting a finger, but you got to tell me, how could you die from a lawnmower accident? You'd almost have to say, Bob, I'll be right back. I think there's something wrong with the blade. And boom, right underneath there. How could you do something like that? How could somebody do that? They underestimated the enemy in the aircraft. Unbelievable. They underestimate the enemy on the ground as well as in the air. This is very important to consider. A buddy of mine, his name is John, I won't give you the last name, but he used to fly for a company in Southern California called, well, I can't tell you the name of the company because the people at Golden West will get really upset. But company's no longer in business. Maybe this story explains why. They landed at Lancaster Airport out in the desert, 11,000-foot runway, and he landed with a captain. My buddy John's a co-pilot. They're in a Twin Otter now, Twin Otter turbine aircraft, and they land, and the captain says, he's a little scrawny guy. He's about 135 pounds, smokes a big old cigar. He's from Mississippi. Sort of one of those redneck kind of guys. Because in Mississippi, their idea of gun control is holding it with both hands, if you understand what I'm saying. They land this aircraft. They go in. The captain's kind of a weird guy. John never flew with him. Captain takes a whole bag of peanuts, pours it into a Coke, stirs it around a little bit, and then drinks it. This is not typical, usual behavior. They get back out. It's 11 o'clock at night. Wind is gusting to 35 knots on an 11,000-foot runway. The captain looks at John, and again, from Mississippi, he has that sort of southern brogue. He says, hey, John, did you ever make a downwind takeoff in a Twin Otter? And John says, no. Captain says, well, you know, I hear it is absolutely something spectacular to behold. And John goes, yeah. And the guy goes, what do you say we give it a try? My buddy John goes, bah, and the guy goes, perfect, let's do it. They taxi out onto the runway, 11,000 feet, downwind takeoff, 35 knots in this Twin Otter. Now, folks, in order to make a Twin Otter engine work, a turbine engine, you've got to have wind blowing through it this way. It's just like a wing. Whenever you have wind blowing over the wing this way, that is good. If anything ever happens on your aircraft to make the wind blow this way, that's bad. They get on the runway, the captain, little scrawny guy with a big old cigar sticking out of his mouth, and says, you're going to like this, John. Takes those throttles, stuffs them in this Twin Otter, and all of a sudden the aircraft starts, and all of a sudden they accelerate very slowly, and as they're going down the runway, the right engine flamed out because of the air blowing into it. The left engine is kicking in and starts going to the right. John grabs his seat cushion, pulls up just like this, and all of a sudden the right engine kicks in, the left engine kicks out because it's got air blowing into the exhaust stack rather than going this way. Right engine kicks in, boom, aircraft turns to the right. John's going, whoop. John can't talk. Blood flow's cut off to the carotid arteries to go to the base of the brain. Oxygenated, nourished blood is no longer getting to the neocortex. The corpus callosum is no longer transferring signals from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. He is now operating on the primitive mammalian R complex of his brain. He can't talk. He's making those reptilian sounds. He's going, oh, oh. Oh. Aircraft veers to the right, and all of a sudden, boom, right engine is still going, left engine kicks in, right engine, boom, just like this. They're 5,000 feet down the runway. Airspeed reads 35 knots, and just the speed they'd be if they let the thing coast down the runway with a 35-knot wind. And John's going, oh, oh, holding up on his seat, and the captain's sitting there, and he just looks over at John, got a big cigar sticking out of his mouth like that, and all of a sudden those little feet are doing a dance. I'll haul 135 pounds of this guy trying to fly this thing, and all of a sudden they're coming up, they're about 500 feet from the edge of the runway. You hear John tell the story, and the captain pulls back on the stick, stall horns on this thing, the aircraft is shaking, and all of a sudden, and just cleared those runway lights by about 15 feet, and they're up in the air. And all of a sudden, the aircraft flying, and John's going, and the captain looks over and says, you see, I told you that was something spectacular to behold. But they underestimated the enemy, and that's a very important thing not to do in an aircraft. Folks, if you're flying an airplane and you are in icing conditions, better yet, if you're in an airplane and you are in the clouds, If you're in the clouds at 0 degrees Celsius or less, absolute guarantee you're going to get ice. Absolute guarantee. 0 degrees Celsius or less, you will get ice. Now think about that. If you're in, now how fast the ice accretes depends on how thick the cloud happens to be. But one of the things we cannot do is not do something and take corrective action. We need to immediately solve the problem. In other words, not underestimate the enemy. If you're flying an airplane, the engine starts getting really rough, and I mean it gets getting rough and more rough, you need to do something right now. You need to take action and solve the problem right now. Very important thing. Very important to consider. Instead of waiting to solve the problem, never underestimate the enemy. That's the second quality that distinguishes those that have this survival orientation versus those that do not have this defense capability, what I call this safety reflex. It's so important to have. Now the next rule, and this is a very important rule, the next rule, and I want you to consider this, is that anytime you fly, there are natural enemies to be dealt with. No matter what you do. Folks, when you're in an airplane, flying around in today's airspace system, there are 44,000 thunderstorms on the planet at any one time. Now you may think if you avoid those things, visually you have nothing to worry about. Yes, unless you happen to be William Rankin. William Rankin underestimated the enemy. Flying an F-8 Crusader at 48,000 feet in 1959 in a warm weather flight suit, he bailed out of his Crusader because it had an engine failure, flame out, for what reasons we do not know. William Rankin came out, bailed out into the mature stage of a thunderstorm. Now, I must tell you, truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to make sense. His chute opened, he looked down, and he sees he's going into this thunderstorm. His first words were, oh, oh, oh. Right down in there. Here it is. Here he is. There's his chute. This is the direction of flight. He goes into this thing. Updrafts are so strong, as he gets down here, they suck him back up into the bowels of the thunderstorm. And it takes him up here, gives him hypoxia, knocks him out, takes him back down here, gives him a wake-up call, sucks him back up into the thunderstorm, takes him back down, up and down, and up and down, and up and down, and up and down, for 30 minutes, according to the radar plot, between the time he left his aircraft and the time he got down. 30 minutes. Now, the FAA cannot prove it, but they suspect as he was going up and down, he was probably saying what is known as bad words. We don't know exactly. He wrote a book. Some of you probably have read this book, and the book is titled The Man Who Rode the Thunder. And I think he wrote a sequel to it called Why I Don't Eat Snow Cones. So you can figure out why. Folks, if that is not underestimating the enemy, I don't know what is in this case. What I'm trying to impress upon you is this. The only way to survive the most unusual things that will occur in an aircraft is to think defensively. The strangest things happen. Chuck Yeager was flying an aircraft at 20,000 feet, flying a formation with another gentleman. They were doing apparently some type of photo mission, and in his book he talks about, actually in Tom Wolfe's book called The Right Stuff, he talks about this. When people become suddenly hypoxic, they become belligerent, such as a drunk would become belligerent in this case. And Chuck realizes this man was starting to say groggy things, things that did not make much sense. And Chuck says to this man, 3-2 Bravo, or whatever his number was, he said, put on your oxygen mask. And this man, according to Chuck Yeager, started suggesting unusual anatomical impossibilities. And Chuck realized he had a problem. But what made Chuck Yeager so unique was he had thought about several times what he would do in a situation just like this. And he realized that it was a problem, so he called out to this man. He said, follow me down. And the guy would not follow what Chuck Yeager was doing. He was not comprehensive. He was not cogitative in this case. He couldn't think. Hypoxia has a tendency to, in essence, render a person's IQ a grade lower than bean dip, if you understand what I'm saying. Very effective that way. So Chuck Yeager hit on a plan. He said, help me, I'm going down, I've just lost my engine. And here's this guy flying the aircraft thinking that the fabled Chuck Yeager has just lost his engine in this other jet, and this sort of revives the man's awareness and consciousness, and this guy pulls his power back, follows him down to 12,000 feet or so, where the guy, of course, is revived. Well, again, what gave Chuck Yeager his survival orientation was he never underestimated the enemy. Folks, at Orange County Airport, we had a situation where a guy, talk about underestimating the enemy, a guy in his aircraft had the little placard taken off the Cessna 152 that actually shows the N number on the airplane. You know, when the ATC calls you and says, what's your number? And you say, let's see, here it is, 2132 Bravo. Placard was gone. So what do you think he did? Tower says, says aircraft ready for taxi, what's your number? And the guy's holding short right over there of the runway threshold, or the taxiway onto the run-up area, excuse me. And the guy goes, stand by. He opens the door. I couldn't make this up if I wanted to, folks. Truth is stranger than fiction, because fiction has to make sense. He opens the door, proceeds to lean out the back of the aircraft. He's going to look at the tail as he leans out the back. Now, I know this is happening because I'm sitting there with my student. We're watching this guy. My student goes, look at that guy over there. And he opens his door, and he's leaning, and folks, he falls out of his seat. I couldn't make this up if I wanted to. He falls out of his seat. He slips around the shoulder harness. The shoulder harness catches him by his lower hip. The seat belt, which was put on loosely, catches him right around the thighs. And he's hanging out of the aircraft, holding onto the microphone, which was the coolest part. And he's holding like that. And what do you think happens to his pressure on the brakes as he did this? He lets go of the brakes. And now he's in an aircraft. Actually, he's not in it. Only part of him is in it. He's taxiing. 2/3 of his body is hanging out of the airplane. And he's holding onto the radio. And what would have been so cool if he would have said, that's 413 Charlie Tango. No chance. Another guy in another airplane behind him had to run out over to him and push him back into his airplane. Folks, strange things have happened. Stranger things have happened before to airplanes. Southern California, we had a guy I couldn't make this up if I wanted to, another bizarre story. What I'm trying to impress upon you is that there are strange, strange things that can occur. Student pilot, an off-duty policeman in his airplane on a cross-country flight. Figures he's going to get flight following. So he calls local air traffic control center, and ATC says, Roger 32 Bravo, squawk altitude. He's flying at 7,500 feet. His transponder wasn't turned on to the altitude mode. It was turned on to the on mode, not the altitude mode. Controller told him to squawk altitude. So what do you think he did? He reached over, turned the transponder numbers to his altitude, 7,500 feet. He went 7500. Now think back to the last time you read the Airman's Information Manual. What does the Airman's Information Manual say to use 7,500 for? Hijack, exactly. He set 7,500 in there. Controller comes on and says, 32 Bravo, is there a gun on board the aircraft? Honest to goodness, true story. Look at what can happen. This guy was an off-duty policeman. What do off-duty police officers carry with them when they're flying? A gun. They carry it with them. They said, is there a gun on the aircraft? And he said, you bet. The controller says, well, 32 Bravo, where do you want to go? And he said, well, you know, these people here are awful nice. You know, I'm going to have to fly this route more often. This is just wonderful. Well, I've never had this service before, especially in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. This is terrific. He says, I want to go to Fullerton, wherever they took him. So they said, fly heading 340 degrees. This is vectors Fullerton. We'll give you vectors all the way into the pattern, all the way down to the ground to touchdown. So he landed. When he landed, the controller said this. Remember, that's the hijack code. The controller, when he landed, says, 32 Bravo, taxi to the end of the runway and stop. And he said, okay. He goes to the end of the runway, stop, and all of a sudden, 15 people with large machine guns come up to the end of the runway. And he thought, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not coming to this airport anymore. These people aren't too friendly over here. Isn't that amazing something like that could happen? You know, by the way, if you ever go to Miami International Airport, the international symbol for hijacking, if you don't happen to have the transponder code set to the hijack code, is to go to the end of the runway, leave the flaps down, and leave the engine running, and stop, and don't move. Folks, think about this. That's exactly what a student pilot will do when they go to a brand new airport. And you know what they'll do at Miami? They'll come out and they will shoot out your tires. So here you are as a student pilot. You go to the end of the runway, all of a sudden, nothing wrong with that. Doesn't seem quite right. The point I'm trying to make is this. Never underestimate the enemy. Always have an alternate plan. Folks, you must understand, in aviation, anything can happen. Expect the unexpected. Fort Rucker, Army Helicopter Training School. Student pilot at Fort Rucker from Vietnam, Vietnamese student pilot, flying along in his helicopter, he's just getting some solo practice in, and again, he's on an exchange program, so to speak. He's flying along, and all of a sudden, he decides he has to answer the call of Mother Nature. He takes his helicopter, he lands it on a pinnacle, and this is right from one of the instructors at Fort Rucker, who happens to be the person involved with accident investigation. He lands his helicopter on a pinnacle, keeps the engine running, and the blades are still spinning, although, albeit slowing down. He shimmies down the hill, nobody else in his helicopter, to answer the call of Mother Nature. A wind comes up, blows his helicopter off the other side of the hill, and he can't hear it because it's on the blind, it's on the other side of the hill. He's down there in the trees, answering the call of Mother Nature. Another helicopter pilot flying around sees smoke from the other side of the hill coming from what appears to be a crashed helicopter. And there's a pinnacle right next to the crashed helicopter. So he lands on the pinnacle, keeps his engine running. The blades are spinning down. He hops out of his helicopter to go down into the ravine to help on the other side of the hill this apparent downed helicopter pilot. Meanwhile, the young Vietnamese fellow who's just finished answering the call of Mother Nature shimmies up the hill, gets in what he thinks is his helicopter, and takes back off. Now you've got to ask yourself, how could that happen? How could something like that happen? Truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to make sense. And in an airplane, things do not always make sense. Folks, this next rule, and this is a very important rule, is when you're flying an airplane, always expect the unexpected. Always expect the unexpected. Your job in an airplane is to do this, and that is to enhance your aviation intelligence. And aviation intelligence is enhanced. In fact, this is so important. What I'm about to tell you is so important for literally expecting the unexpected. Everybody take your finger, just like this. I know this sounds strange. Do this. Do this. Trust me on this one. Trust me on this one. Take your finger, do that right there. Do it. Just do it. Because what I'm about to tell you is so important, I don't want it to go in one ear and out the other. Take your finger out now. Folks, in an airplane, your job is to establish relationships in the aircraft, to see relationships. And we know from psychology that a person's intelligence is, in essence, reduced to his ability to be able to establish relationships between things. In essence, that's what intelligence is. You know, a good flight instructor will help you when you're out at the flight line establish relationships, such as when you look at the antennas on an airplane. If you've ever noticed, the ADF antenna is the one that is the longest. And that's because the ADF antenna is the antenna that receives the lowest frequency with the, in essence, the longest wave form. And then the marker beacon antenna is the second longest antenna on the aircraft because that receives VHF transmissions on the 75 megahertz band, which is actually above, a little bit shorter wavelength than kilohertz transmissions from ADF or NDB stations. So it's a little smaller. And then the VHF antennas receive on the frequency of 110.0 to 139 point something. And in essence, they are slightly higher frequency, in other words, shorter wavelength. And as a result, the antenna is a little bit smaller. The DME antenna and the VHF glide slope antenna receive the smallest length of frequency wavelength, and they're the smallest antenna. Well, the point is, sometimes we don't even notice those things. Your ability to ask questions and see relationships is paramount to being a defensive strategist in the aircraft. Folks, let me ask you this. You're walking along the airport, you see a mechanic walk by. The mechanic's suit is torn. I mean, just torn and just shredded to pieces. And then you look over and you see a pit bull with a smile on its face. What do you think? It's the same thing when you're walking around the airport. You look down on the tarmac and you see a Hobbs meter fuse. And then you look over and you see a student pilot with a smile on its face. What do you think? Same thing you should think when you're flying an aircraft. You should ask questions when flying. Folks, the way to think in an airplane is to ask questions. In other words, to start an internal dialogue, to ask yourself, such as questions that we ask when we're flying, such as, how am I feeling? Self-monitoring. How am I feeling? Do I feel good today? Do I feel bad today? How am I feeling? Chuck Yeager, flying an F-100 at something like around 18,000 feet, had a flame out in the aircraft. Aircraft flamed out. Now, folks, you do not dead stick an F-100 into any airport anywhere at any time. In essence, what you have is an anvil hooked to wheels. That's what it is. But Chuck Yeager said something, and I must admit, I use his name a lot because I think he really had this survival quality, this survival reflex. He said, today I just felt particularly good. And he decided to dead stick it in. But he could do that, the Chuck Yeagers of the world, specifically because they had this ability to sense intuitively how they felt inside. They could monitor. But we don't normally do that. Sometimes we get fatigued, we go fly, and we don't realize that there are 10 times more single-pilot IFR accidents at night than there are during the day. 10 times more single-pilot IFR accidents at night than there are during the day. Now, what's the reason for that? One guy in one presentation said, oh, because it's dark. Well, that's true. It normally gets that way at night. You know why? We get tired. We get tired, and we don't even think about getting down on the ground, and we don't even think about handling our fatigue. How many of you folks have ever gone to a drive-in movie and woke up the next day at a swap meet? How many people have ever done that? We get tired. We don't think about taking out the oxygen mask and taking a hit of oxygen before we make an approach. A perfectly legitimate thing to do, by the way. We don't think about, at night, if we're tired, perhaps staying on oxygen. We don't think about using sunflower seeds that have a special chemical that stimulates awareness, keeps us awake, to say nothing to the fact that I don't know of anybody who's ever fallen asleep while eating sunflower seeds. And whenever I'm flying an airplane and I have a co-pilot, I always carry sunflower seeds for me and red pistachios for him. And there's a reason for that. Because it's pretty hard for me to fall asleep when I'm thinking about how much fun I'm going to have on the ground watching him walk around with big red lips on his face. You can have all kind of fun in aviation. That's perhaps one way. Let me take you back to the year. It's 1989. It's July 19th. And let me put you at 38,000 feet in a DC-10. Your name is Captain Alfred C. Haynes. You're a man in command of a DC-10 en route to Chicago over Sioux City, Iowa. And you're going to do what the best of the best do in a situation where they now have to operate defensively. You are, in this case, you are not going to anticipate the unexpected in this case and not have a plan. You've got a plan. You've thought about what would happen in this situation. Folks, Captain Haynes on that DC-10 of United Airlines had the number 2 engine turbine fail, sever in flight. It acted like a buzzsaw. It went slicing through the only 3 hydraulic lines controlling and providing control pressure for the control surfaces on the aircraft. All 3 control hydraulic lines were severed. in essence rendering the aircraft completely uncontrollable except for one electronic trim on the horizontal stabilizer, and in this case, one engine that's working and one engine that's partially working. Captain Haynes is inside the aircraft. Flight engineer is looking up at this panel and all of a sudden sees a vertical array of lights, boom, shoot right up the panel, and he looks at that. He studies that just for a second, has never seen anything quite like this before. He looks and he goes, Captain Haynes looked back and he says, "Hey Bob, what are all those?" The co-pilot has the control yoke pulled all the way back. The aircraft is in a right descending turn. The control yoke is turned to the left, pulling back, and Captain Haynes tells the story just like this. In his own words, Captain Haynes says, "I looked over, the co-pilot had pulled back on the stick, turned it to the left completely, and said this." He said, "Captain, I've got full back stick, full left wheel, and the aircraft is in a right descending turn." And Captain Haynes said that at that moment, he said the most unintelligent, stupid thing he's ever said in his entire life. He looked over, and as captains are wont to do, he said, "Okay, Bob, let go. I've got it." Well, you can have it. Here, take the whole thing, too. It's not doing me any good right here. You might as well fly with two of them. They had no control. But Captain Haynes was a very smart man. And I look forward to someday having a chance to meet this man, because what he did was this. He realized that his key to survival in the aircraft was asking questions. That's how he knew how he was going to survive. He called up a reserve captain from the first-class coach section, put him up in the cockpit and said, "Gentlemen, we have got a real severe problem." They had 4 people in the cockpit now. He said, "We've got a problem that we've never experienced before. The Douglas commercial engineers said such a thing was likely to occur only once every 300 years. 300 years. I guess you could say that M&M's melted in Captain Haynes' hands." You wanted to say that. But Captain Haynes did the right thing. He said, "I need your input." He said, "I need you to give me information." He said, "Gentlemen, we are not going to make any decision on this aircraft unless everybody contributes, number one, and after they contribute, they all agree that this is the right thing to do." And that's what allowed Captain Haynes to land an aircraft with over 300 souls on board with such a minimal loss of life. They just, in essence, the group cohesed, and they became greater than the sum of their individual parts, if you will. As a pilot in the aircraft, your job is to ask questions. And folks, whether you realize it or not, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow night dealing with single pilot IFR, when you fly IFR, you are not alone. There is no such thing as single pilot IFR. If you're in an airplane and you have trouble, you pick up the microphone and you use air traffic control as your co-pilot. What you do is you pick up the microphone and you ask questions. The same way when you're flying an airplane, if you don't know what's going on out in front of you weather-wise, the best weather you are ever going to get, ever, forever, is going to come from the pilot up in front of you on the airway in an airplane experiencing it before you get there. It's called a pilot report. Asking questions. Very, very important. Some people think 121.5 is for emergencies only, and that is a misconception. That's a big misconception. That's like believing that when you go to rent the movie Caligula, it will improve your handwriting. Take some time on this one. The thing is, in order to get smart in aviation, you have got to ask questions. Very important. If you are ever in the throes of an emergency, I'd like you to use this particular internal dialogue as a question-asking schema, if you will, to allow you to ferret out the proper activity. First of all, let me tell you, the psychologists tell us that we spend 70% of our time talking to ourselves. 70% of the time. And what's really interesting about that is some of you even talk back. Perfectly natural behavior. And by actually talking to ourselves, we're able to guide our own behavior. We've heard for many years people tell us that if you are in a state of exigency, if you're getting a little angry, what should you do? You should talk to yourself. What do you say to yourself? Relax, don't you? I was in a grocery store. I saw a father with his young child in a grocery basket. They're walking around the store, and the kid's just throwing a terrible tantrum. I mean, bad. I don't think there's been a tantrum that bad this side of the Newark localizer. It is the worst thing that you've ever seen. And this man's walking around going, calm down, Monty. Calm down, Monty. Remain calm, Monty. And I am so impressed with this man's demeanor and the way that he is controlling himself. He's going, relax, Monty. Just relax. And this kid's arms are flailing. I was so impressed. I followed him around the store. He's going, relax, Monty. Calm down, Monty. And I walked up to him and I said, sir, you know, I am really impressed with the way you are talking to your child. I am so impressed the way that you are demonstrating such extreme patience. I got to tell you, I'm really impressed. He says, hey, buddy, you don't understand. I'm Monty. In an airplane, first question you should ask, if you have any problem whatsoever, is this question, and that is, number one, this is part of the 4-step emergency internal dialogue. Number one, what is happening? Number one, identify the problem. Now, I know that sounds strange, but in many cases, when we're in a situation like that, we do not identify the problem. What we do is we just sort of fly along and just sort of wait and see what happens. We don't actively get involved and start ferreting out the problem. So in the event that you have an engine failure or the engine's running rough, what's happening? Is it the mixture that's sticking 2.5 feet out of the firewall and you are at 1,500 feet MSL? Is that the problem? Is it the fact that you haven't used carburetor heat in about the last 150 hours of flight? Is it the fact that maybe you've been on one tank for about 5.5 hours and you're flying in a 172? What's happening? Number two, second question I want you to ask, okay? What do I have to do to solve the problem? Okay, and we heard the word back there, pray. There's nothing wrong with prayer. And just pray into the microphone as well as casting the prayer into the atmosphere. What do you have to do to solve the problem? Ask yourself this question. What do you have to do? Now, what I'm trying to do is get you actively involved with solving the problem. The third thing I want you to do is this. Ask yourself, what limitations must I observe? Let's take this problem, folks. What limitations must I observe? You're in an airplane, and all of a sudden, you find that you are getting ice. And by the way, getting ice at night sometimes is very difficult to determine unless you have a flashlight. That's why some pilots don't carry flashlights when they fly IFR at night. Because the first rule is, if you don't look at it, it will go away. And folks, if you ever take a flashlight at night and you're getting a little ice and you shine it out there in that wing, you will know you're getting ice real quick. So you ask yourself, what is happening? Okay, you've got the problem right there. What do I have to do to solve the problem? What do you have to do to solve the problem if you are getting a plane load of ice? What do you have to do? You have a couple choices here. Find a way out. Yeah, pray. That's okay. Pray. Find a way out. In other words, what about going back to the area from whence you came? We have to make the assumption here that you took off in an area that did not have what? Ice. Now, I'm assuming that most people know you just don't fly into ice, because most people have a lot of common sense. Common sense being defined as the thing that causes you never to buy a TV from a man who's on a street corner that's out of breath, if you understand what I'm saying. What do you have to do to solve the problem? Number one, you either have to get out of the clouds. Number two, you have to get to where it's warm, possibly going down, or making a 180-degree turn. And if you can't make a 180, you make 2 90s in the same direction. This is a good plan. What limitations must I now observe? Well, number one, don't try and climb. That's not a very wise thing to do. You might think about limitations in terms of you're not going to make your destination. You have to find a new place to land. In fact, the fourth step in this internal dialogue is, when do I have to land? I know that sounds so simple, but folks, this is an internal dialogue that is used by the Army Helicopter School to get a pilot into the throes, into the mentality of solving a problem, which in many cases people don't do. They wait until the problem is, in essence, has engulfed them before they actually start to solve the problem. So very, very important to consider that. So use that internal dialogue, and I think you'll find it very effective. Folks, also consider this. that in an airplane, in small airplanes, it takes cunning to fly a small airplane. It does take a lot of cunning. And I think you should consider that you folks, we, flying small airplanes, we don't have the advantage that pilots have flying big aircraft. Folks, if you're flying a 727 or a 737 or a 747, in essence, you have enough engines on that thing to make the aircraft get away from the problem. In other words, put it this way, you have your own big problems in a big jet, but getting away is not one of them. Now, you may be flying a turbo-stretched 150 with JATO assist takeoff, and maybe you have a special modified aircraft that allows you to get away quickly, but folks, as a small airplane driver, you have to be cunning. You have to think like a person that is defensive in orientation. You have to think about protecting yourself, and that's why I think people that are cunning have this, again, this defense orientation. I say cunning in a good way, specifically because at Orange County Airport, and by the way, that's Orange County in Southern California, not the one that you have here, but at Orange County Airport, on the ramp, I looked over, saw a guy in a 182 get out of the aircraft, strangest thing I've ever seen. He had a big old bass fishing vest on, the orange fluorescent bass fishing vest, and he had one of those red berets on. He had a red beret and bass fishing vest. I think he had some fishing lures up here. Kind of looked like one of those people, what do they call them, the guardian anglers? But he had that thing on. Okay, he didn't have he had the beret, but he didn't have the fishing lures, but he could have. He had this bass fishing vest on. It was filled with a bunch of things. And I'm always curious about people that are different at the airport, so I walked up to him, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm just kind of curious. What have you got in that thing?" And he says, "Well," he says, "I got a bunch of things." He says, "Take this, for example." And he pulls out a pair of goggles. Now, have you ever looked at Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of the Lakers running down the court with these racquetball goggles on? Have you ever seen those before? Yeah. And I'm thinking, now, just what kind of sports does this guy play in this airplane? But he said, "These aren't for sports." I said, "What are they for?" He says, "Well, in an airplane," I thought this was so intriguing, "in the airplane, if there was ever an electrical fire, the smoke, the toxic fumes could render me without sight. Because, in essence, the toxic fumes could cause my eyes to water so bad, I'd have to close them in order to protect my sight." He says, "I put these little babies on, just like that, I can see through anything." And I thought, that's interesting. So then I said, "What's in that pocket?" And he said, "Oh," he pulls out this thing. In a baggie, he had 2 wet towels. I thought, now that's really interesting. "What's that for?" He says, "Well, in the event that I ever have to breathe through smoke, these 2 things will do it. It will act as a filter, a temporary filter for me, at least to be able to breathe through the smoke." I thought, that's interesting. So I said, "Ooh, what's in that pocket right there?" He pulls out 10 big, large baggies, the kind you use, again, for fairly good-sized sandwiches, and a straw. And I thought, no. What could you possibly use that for? He says, "Well, if I'm ever over open water," he said, "what I do is take the straw, stick it in one end of the baggie, zip the baggie all the way up to the end, and blow in the baggie, inflate the baggie, pull the straw out, zip it, stick it right in there. 5 of those things keep me afloat until help arrives." I'm not kidding you. By the way, that is used by the military, in some facets of military training, for an impromptu flotation device. Had 5 baggies for him. Actually, he was slightly overweight, had 9 baggies for him, and 1 baggie for his skinny passenger in the aircraft. I thought, now this is really getting interesting. I said, "You know, you're dressed in rather unusual slacks here for this occasion." He says, "I never fly in anything but cotton clothes." I said, "That's unusual." He actually had wool and cotton on. He had a wool shirt on, had cotton pants on. I said, "Why is that?" He says, "Because if you're ever flying an airplane and the airplane catches fire, if there's any kind of fire," this is so rare. The fact is, it's so incredibly rare, but the point is, it's defensive thinking. He's protecting himself, just in case. He says if the airplane ever catches fire, cotton clothing and wool clothing does not burn onto the body. It burns on its own, starting from the outer layer of the fabric in. However, if you are wearing polyester or a combination of polyester, which in essence is plastic, as the plastic starts to burn, what does it do? It's like napalm. It burns into the body. There was a gentleman standing outside, right in front of a 737 at Los Angeles Airport. The engine was being started. In other words, it was going through its start cycle. What happened was there was a backfire, sort of like a compressor stall in this thing, but it wasn't quite a compressor stall. Flames rushed forward toward him, and they weren't flames that were bad enough to actually cause damage to the skin, but the flames melted the person's clothing onto his body. He suffered 90-degree burns over, or I should say third-degree burns, over 90% of his body. And in essence, he had a real serious problem. My point to you is this: polyester clothing really is not a wise thing to wear in an aircraft. But the thing that got me was this. He had gloves on. He had leather gloves on. I thought, I know why you've got those on. He said, why is that? I said, that is to look cool in case you're ramp checked. He said, nope, that's not it. I said, well, why in the world would you possibly wear gloves flying a small little general aviation airplane like this? And he said this. I thought this is so important. He says, if an airplane is on fire, or if my passenger is in an airplane and if there's any fire, getting out of an airplane that's on fire or getting into an airplane, opening a door that's hot, it's impossible to do with bare hands. And if you lose your hands, if you burn them, then your chance of survival goes down dramatically. This guy actually wore gloves when he flew for that reason, not to look cool. He also wore impact-resistant glasses. Now, folks, dark glasses, most glasses that you buy are impact-resistant for one very important reason. How many people in here have ever had a bird strike? Bird strike. Okay, what kind of bird did you hit? Other than a dead one. Seagull, exactly. I hit a seagull and a Cessna 150 in the clouds. I didn't know birds flew in clouds. This one apparently did. Had a little hood on, doing some flying along. Unbelievable. How could you hit a bird in the cloud? You didn't I never thought that would happen. I did. Seagull pushed the main rib right back to the spar. That's the second rib from the root, right back to the spar. Had that seagull hit the windshield, in essence, what we would have had was a hole surrounded by 150. Very dangerous. That's why pilots wear impact-resistant glasses. That's why the military has a provision for no pilots raising their visor below 10,000 feet. Because most birds don't fly above 10,000 feet, because most of them aren't turboed. That's why. All right. And again, what I hope you understand, and I think this is so extremely important, and that is that people do not carry these things and feel fearful as a result of carrying these things. They feel greater confidence knowing that if anything, the unlikeliest event that could occur, they can handle it in an aircraft. That's what I'm trying to convey to you. So they expect the unexpected, and they know that flying a small airplane does require a lot of cunning, especially if you deal with air traffic controllers, folks. You know that the air traffic control, the FAA did a study one time that determined that student pilots experience stress greater than or equal to the stress experienced by a combat pilot under combat conditions. Are you aware of that? Do you know what the one thing was that caused student pilots that kind of stress? Air traffic control. Exactly. My buddy Pete Campbell was sitting in a Beechcraft Baron with John Baker of the AOPA, again, ex-president of the AOPA. And all of a sudden, a clearance is delivered over the microphone, and Pete, being one of the greatest aviation speakers ever walked the earth, an incredible man. He's from the South, he's got a Southern drawl, and this speaker microphone thing almost catches fire with his clearance. And Pete picks up that microphone and says, "Sir, this is Baron 32 Bravo. Any of that stuff you just said impotent?" And the controller said, "Important? Man, that was your clearance." And Pete says, "Well, then why don't you say it like it's important?" So 4 hours later, when they managed to depart, you got to be cunning. It's like my buddy Dave Gwynn. Dave Gwynn writes for Flight Training Magazine. Just an incredible guy. This guy thinks. You know, he really is a thinker. They're taxiing down the taxiway at this airport. A helicopter lands in the middle of the taxiway and just stays there. And the controller comes on and says, "32 Bravo, now you be careful. There's a helicopter up there and I'm not talking to him." Now Dave, he's a thinker. He picks up his microphone and says, "Well then, sir, we won't talk to him either." That's fine with you? We're sitting at Orange County Airport. And all of a sudden, it's unbelievable. A guy comes on and delivers a clearance so fast, I've never heard anything like this before. I mean, this is a clearance at 60 with peak gusts to 90. You have to think now, and the only way to think is by asking yourself questions, trying to establish relationships, looking how to wheedle an advantage in your environment. The controller delivers a clearance, and this guy picks up his microphone and says, "Sir, you hear how fast I'm talking?" And the controller says, "Yes." He says, "Well, good, because this is precisely how fast I listen." Get that straight and get it straight once and right and for all. Folks, the last rule is this, and this is the most important rule. Very, very important. In an aircraft, the ultimate defense and survival edge in an aircraft occurs if you have an emergency. You never, ever, ever stop flying your airplane. You fly it no matter what, and I will tell you, even under the most extreme conditions, I have seen reports in the rarest of events in airplanes. And I must tell you, I'm not telling you this to frighten you. Flying is safe. I'd much rather get in an airplane. I'd much rather get in an airplane with 4 cylinders, only of which 3 may be working at any one time, than to get in an automobile and drive on the freeway. And I'm telling you that, and I'm telling you that is the honest to goodness truth as I see it. Airplanes are very safe. What is unsafe is when we don't think defensively. But what causes pilots problems is when they are in their airplane and they do not continue to fly the airplane when they have a problem. I'd like you to listen to this tape I'm going to play for you. It's a tape of 2 gentlemen, some of the most professional people I have ever heard, and the most professional air traffic controller I have ever heard, in an MU-22, or MU-2, excuse me, in an MU-2 in British Columbia, going to an airport. They're in heavy precipitation. They pick up ice. Now, I want you to listen to this. Listen to how cool the controller is. Listen to the pilots. They never, ever, ever stop flying their aircraft. This is so very important to understand. Even when the airplane experiences the condition that you're going to hear, and they survive this emergency, you will not believe it when you hear it. Let's play the tape.
Vancouver, Romeo, Oscar Mike. Oscar Mike, Vancouver. Roger, Romeo, Oscar Mike, requesting return to Kamloops. Oscar Mike, Roger, and do you have some difficulties now, sir? Yeah, right now we got a bit of a problem. We got pretty heavy ice. Appreciate the heading right now. Okay, Oscar Mike, Roger, what's your heading right now? We're just turning around to a heading of about 210. Oscar Mike, Roger, clear present position, direct Kamloops. As soon as you roll out of it, I'll give you a heading. Hey, Oscar Mike. Oscar Mike, you can have whatever altitude you'd like. Hey, Oscar Mike. Yeah, I told him to turn around. He threw it your way once. Hey, is that what the show is nearest airport for us right now? The nearest airport right now would be either Kamloops or Kelowna. I'll just check it right here on the scale for you. Yeah, check the weather too. Can you get the Kamloops and Kelowna weather for me real quick? We'll see which one's better. Foster, we got an emergency here. Okay, Kelowna is closer by about 10 miles. I check you're in the right turn, and I'll give you a heading for Kelowna. It looks like right now possibly about 220. It'll be better when you roll out of it. Yeah, we checked that. Yeah, it appears that we picked quite a bit of prop ice up, and then they lost a bit, and that's creating off balance with the propeller. Oscar Mike, Roger. Okay, and Kelowna's current weather is 1,300 scattered, 2,500 scattered, measured 5,000 overcast, 12 miles and very light rain. Oscar Mike 13,000 is a safe altitude. Okay, we check that picture. Oscar Mike, I show you now about 6 miles from Kelowna Beach. We Oscar Mike, thank you. Somebody else want to call Kelowna? Oh, no, we can't go through 6. Skipper Romeo Oscar Mike, what's the active runway in Kelowna? Okay, it'll be your choice. I show the wind to Kelowna 160 at 5, so I assume you can do the straight in and 50. Yeah, that'll be fine. Straight in, thanks. It's in Vancouver. Yeah, Oscar Mike won't be coming. He's going to Kelowna. He's got a problem. Okay. How many miles now from Kelowna? I show 5-8 miles, and are you receiving Kelowna Beacon yet, sir? No, not yet. Then what are you showing for ground speed? Show 160 knots. I've shown that for a bit since you've come out of the turn. Consistently 160 ground speed. And I'll take a right 5 sir. For temperature in Kelowna for all. Okay, I show temperature 6, dew point 4, 2988 the altimeter, and it's QFRAC 2, strata Q6. Okay, thank you. Let me know if you want lower than 13. We're just checking out the terrain in there to see what the lowest is we can give you if you need. Okay, right now we're just holding 17.7, but we're getting pretty good vibration here. And, yeah, just keep us posted what we can go down to if we need to. All right. I'll make it 230 degrees. That's another 5, right? You need not acknowledge any transmission. 150 now on the ground speed, 150. Can we check that? At 230 to heading another right 5. Roger. Yeah, distance from Kelowna for ROM. ROM now 48 miles from the beacon. I show 140 knots ground speed. What's your safe altitude for ROM? ROM, say again? Minimum altitude. Okay, 9,500 is the minimum I'll give you for now on that track. Okay, we're going down 500 feet a minute now. Okay. ROM, do you have any contact with the ground at all? Negative. Roger. Distance from Kelowna for ROM. 42 miles. 42. Roger, 42. Okay, and you're just about over the valley that Maple Lake is contained in, if you get any contact with the ground there. Good, check. Maple Lake would be just off to your right by 1 or 2 miles and extend for about another 10 miles to 15 in front of you. Okay, yeah, we're still in heavy precipitant icing. Roger, roger. We're going to try and keep you as close as we can to a saw off between the direct track and then over top of the valley that runs from Maple Lake in towards the North Okanagan there. So if you got to go a lot further down, we'll see if we can do it. Yeah, okay, we're just hanging in. Well, now we're going down about 300 feet a minute at we're on 16.5. Oscar Mike, roger. Mike, just so you know, I am considering this a declared emergency. Yeah, from ROM, if you get one of your buddies, somebody can make a phone call when you get sick. Go right ahead, sir. Your number's, go. I just tell them that, because of heavy ice, we started going down and we're going to put her into Kelowna. We'll give them a call on the ground and also explain that the vibration created. Oscar Mike, roger, roger. Oscar Mike, go ahead. I was just looking for our mileage now from Kelowna, trying to judge yourself. 4-1. That's from the beginning. Okay. Oscar Mike, the lights are on at Kelowna with the strobe to runway 50. Romeo, Oscar Mike, sir. Ground. 110. Doesn't help, okay. Yeah, no. Okay, just so you know, in case we do lose you, at one point we will lose you on this radar. We've got the NORAD radar watching. So, yeah, we're going down about full 400 feet a minute, so. Okay. Yeah, we're going down 1,000 feet a minute now. Oscar Mike, roger. Got a mayday. ROM, roger, roger. Go down 4,000 feet a minute. ROM, roger, roger. Okay, if you can, I turn to the right a bit. We'll probably give you lower terrain. No acknowledgement necessary. Oscar Mike, we just lost both engines. Oscar Mike, roger. Do you have ground contact, sir? The best is if you can head west for the ground contact in the Okanagan Valley, so we can suggest we got everybody coming out for it. Mail coming. Mr. Mike, activate the LT, please. Mr. Mike, ground contact. Get it. Sure. Okay, a little more to the left if you can. Mr. Mike, you're heading to the northwest there. Now bring it around to the west or southwest for better train. Harlan. Please. Oscar Mike, say again. For Kelowna. Oscar Mike, you've got to turn around a left turn about 150 degrees. You're heading into higher terrain that way. Yeah, Oscar Mike left now heading to 220. If you can hold 220. I'm heading 220. 220, Romeo. Oscar Mike in cloud. Affirmative. Oscar Mike, you appear to be in a valley. We have lost radar contact. Just continue south in the general southerly, hitting the 220 as much as you can. Oscar Mike. If you can, advise me ground contact. ROM. We have both engines operating again and we're climbing. Oscar Mike, roger, roger. I'll advise you as soon as I get radar contact. And do you have surface contact, sir? It is, sir. Roger. Oscar Mike's altitude? 15,500. 5,500. Roger, roger. This is from Kelowna. Okay, we'll advise you as soon as we get radar contact, sir. We should get it just momentarily. Mail coming. Oscar Mike, 2988 on the altimeter and your altitude leaving. Mail to Mike, sir, that's 6,600. Oscar Mike, roger, I have radar contact. What direction? Okay, Oscar Mike, I show you now 28 miles from Kelowna, Squawk Ident. Oscar Mike. Oscar Mike, radar contact out of 7,000, and I'm just getting a track on you so I can give you a heading, so you're heading now. Oscar Mike's heading 200 degrees. Oscar Mike, roger, turn right now to 210 degrees. 210 degrees, Romeo, Oscar Mike. We're through 7,300. Okay, check that. How are we doing for terrain? Yeah, terrain's fine now at 7 or above. Thanks very much. Sounds good. A little bit dicey there. We're down to about 4,000. 3,500. You get down to 3,500 where you were and you're still talking to me, it's unbelievable. And we had the Angels on our side. We got her all the way. I can't believe it. Hey, somebody likes us. We got that one right. Not over yet. Yeah, roger.
Good, give it tape. It's not over yet. Now that's the voice of experience, right? Here's this guy flying the airplane, co-pilot, saying, we're going to make it, you're doing just fine. He's happy, he's having a good time. He is happy. He's got both engines started again. That's pretty much enough to make most people in here pretty happy. And the captain says, it's not over yet. Wow, isn't that something? It's incredible. So, they ran out of gas and crashed short of the airport. So, no, I'm just kidding. That's just a joke. That is a joke to relieve some of the tension. Look at this. In this aircraft, here, these boys is what makes me proud to be part of this aviation fraternity. These guys never stop flying their aircraft. This aircraft was loaded up with ice. They were at 17,500 feet, down now to 13,000. They get down to an altitude of 3,500 feet. They start going down at 500 feet per minute. It increases to 1,000 feet per minute and then to 4,000 feet per minute. Folks, that is not a descent. Their aircraft was stalled. Their aircraft picked up so much ice, it's stalled. And then the engines flamed out, probably because the air was going perpendicular to the engine intake rather than parallel into the engine air intake vents. Unbelievable. But what did they do? What did they do that was so, in my estimation, I hope in yours, so defense-oriented here? They never stopped what? They never stopped flying their airplane. Never. And they were always in contact with the controller. Anybody who would ever tell me that there are not controllers out there that won't help you out, I'll tell you what, this guy was good. He was really, really good. The pilots were good. The co-pilot was great. Those folks kept flying their airplane. I am impressed. And that's what they did. And that's the last rule, and that is never, under any circumstance, ever stop flying your airplane. Those guys did it in the clouds, IFR. They were down in the valley. They were so low that they could not get picked up on radar. And they were between the mountain peaks in the clouds. And by the way, this was all at night. So what does that tell you about that last rule? No matter what it is, you continue to fly your airplane. Folks, I firmly believe this, and that is our dignity in an airplane consists in thought. And by it, we must elevate ourselves, if you will. It's our key to salvation in an airplane. Although airplane is extremely safe, Mother Nature, as the old apocryphal statement goes, is very unforgiving of any problems that happen to occur. So I'd like you to consider this, that no matter whatever happens to you in an airplane, always, always keep flying. Never underestimate the enemy. Always acknowledge your own vulnerability. Realize that there are natural enemies to be dealt with, and understand that the cunning that it takes to fly an aircraft is a function of, in essence, how well you think and the relationships that you have established. And thinking, the most important thing tonight, and I hope you really received this. This is important to me. And that is, instead of thinking as aviation from a fight or flight point of view, think of it as getting in an airplane and defending yourself. Again, in the words of Sun Tzu, the ultimate invincibility lies in a good defense. If that means, of course, always having a place to land when you fly, always having the goggles, the leather gloves, the cotton clothing versus the polyester clothing, whatever it takes, whatever you feel is valuable for you, do that. And I'd like to leave you with one last story. I tell this story a lot, and I've never told it to this group, and I'd like to tell it to you because it really does emphasize the point, and that is thinking. As George says, common sense, which is a function of how well we think, is very important. Emerson once said that the strong take it away from the weak, but the smart take it away from the strong. And that's not meant to be pugilistic or bellicose. It's meant to show you how important it is to think. At Orange County Airport in 1976, I was in the run-up area with a student of mine, and we were doing a run-up in this 150. He's doing a good run-up. Click, 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 boom. As students are wont to do with their run-up sometime. And all of a sudden, the controller calls up and says, "Friggy Bravo, would you let a Hughes Air West DC-9 jet go by?" And I think it's important to get the big guys up in the air first, so I said, "Well, yes, sir. Let them go by." So we did. So he taxis right on by. Because it's important to think of our big brother and sister aviators, too. And so controller calls up 5 minutes later, and we're almost done with our run-up. He said, "Would you let another Hughes Air West DC-9 jet go by?" And I said, "Yes, sir. Let them go by." The jet taxis out, and it was great. Then it was our turn. So we start coming out of the run-up area. And as we start nudging toward the runway threshold, I look over, and out of my peripheral vision to the left, I capture a picture of a large aluminum megalith. It was a Boeing 737 taxiing down the taxiway. Now, for those of you who don't know what Boeing means, Boeing is the Cherokee Indian word for, man, look how big that thing is. This guy is taxiing down the taxiway and sees this little airplane going for his spot. So airline pilots are kind of macho. Well, not so macho that they fly around with more chains on than a snow tire, if you understand what I'm saying. But he was kind of macho, and so what do you think he did? He grabbed a handful of JT-8D 20,000 horsepower thrust engines, stows them in the front quadrant of his aircraft, and proceeds to race his aircraft down the taxiway to my spot. At the time, I was 23 years old. I didn't have enough common sense to get off an escalator during a power failure. Not proud of that. We race to the runway threshold. He slams on his brakes at a V angle. I slam on mine. I'm looking up at this guy, this big, giant aircraft right here. There he is right there. 737. That's the number of engines on this thing. It was incredible. Engines all over this thing. Here's this guy right here, his captain right here, is the big stick they fly with. And and like that. And there's little bitty airplanes that have been impaled on the side of the aircraft in past flights. And here I am right down here, folks. Here I am right down here. Here we are, little Cessna 150. There we are. And I'm looking up at him, and he's looking down at me. And he gives me the wildest look I've ever seen in my entire life. He's kind of looking down at me like that. And in an attempt to intimidate me, he did what a high school kid would do at 17 years old with his daddy's car at a stoplight. Parked next to him is somebody that looks like they are intimidable. He reaches over and grabs those engines with those brakes locked and goes, I'm not kidding you. Exactly as I'm telling you this story, exactly happened like that. He goes, my little airplane's vibrating like that. And he does it again. I looked for my student. I couldn't find him. Hey, Bob, where are you? And he made the typical student retreat. He was underneath the front seat in the fetal position, making transmissions. Strangely enough, he wasn't using a radio for those transmissions, because the person he wanted to talk to, he didn't need a radio for, if you understand what I'm saying. I said, you get out here, and you sit up that seat like a man. I said, you can let that guy do that to you? And the student looks at me and goes, oh. I said, what are you going to do? And the student goes, oh, like that. Like that. Back there. I said, you give him a blast of that Continental 200, 100 horsepower engine. So he reached over. Like my daddy said, you fight fire with fire. Every once in a while, that fourth cylinder would kick in, and you like that. And here we are, folks. And the controller picks up his glasses, and in the control tower, a quarter mile away, and says, what is going on out there? Give me those things like that. And he starts thinking, oh. Hey, Bob, Frank, come here. You're not going to bring the video camera with you, too. Can you believe those guys? We were doing what they did in the island of Bali 2,000 years ago, and we are doing it in a much more sophisticated way. We are no longer using facsimile look-alike dolls with pins that we stick in order to create the voodoo curse. We are using high-tech equipment. The controller picks up his microphone and says, gentlemen, now listen, you, 32 Bravo, the Cessna 150, and you, Boeing 737, Air California. You both showed up at the same time. Who wants to go first? You got to think. You've got to think. So I pick up my microphone real quickly in my small little airplane, and I transmit it in my deepest airline pilot voice, and I go, yes, sir, this is the big jet. You can let our little buddy go first. It was incredible. And they both gave us the victory sign. Well, they gave us half of it. It was as close. And the controller picks up his microphone and says, well, 32 Bravo, you are clear for takeoff in Air California. That's awful nice of you. You're clear for takeoff. And by the way, Air California, where are you going today? And I think he said, well, wherever our little buddy's going. Awesome. You gotta think. Gotta think. Now, folks, I'll tell you, at Oshkosh 3 years ago, I told that story. One guy in the audience raised his hand and goes, hey. And I said, what? He said, remember me? I couldn't stop him. He ran up on stage, stuck his hand out and says, I'm the guy that was flying the big jet. I grabbed his hand. I looked at the audience and I went, oh. Folks, you have been an absolutely wonderful audience. Take care. God bless. Good flying to you.